The second part of this lecture really has to do with how we are getting from medieval Europe up to the Renaissance. And one major figure in all of that is Petrarch. And Petrarch is the father of humanism, basically. And humanism, as we'll see, I'll explain in the next slide, deals with a couple of other things. But first, regarding Petrarch, you can see his lifespan there, 1304 to 1374. And like his father is a lawyer, and he wants his son Petrarch to get to go into law as well. Petrarch himself, he doesn't really see law as something that is altogether interesting for him. He actually sees the law as a hindrance in a lot of ways. Think of legal red tape, and you're on the right track. So he begins traveling all over, and in his travels, this is right around the same time that a wealth of new information has come to light. In 1215, we see the fall of Constantinople, and that last kind of Christian empire or bastion of the Roman Empire is going to lead to a rediscovery of a variety of classics from ancient Greece, from the early days of ancient Rome, these Roman thinkers from 1,000 years prior who pop up again. And in his travels, he stumbles upon an abbey where he discovers letters from the Roman legal scholar. He does a variety of other things, as do most kind of philosophers in Rome, Cicero. And he begins reading Cicero's letters and then writes letters back to Cicero. He reads the works of Cicero, and then begins writing these kind of dialogues back to Cicero in response to some of Cicero's theories. And it's these letters that he, in part, becomes extremely famous for. And a lot of these letters deal with the individual, and how the individual works. And that last point is really what's going to be the basis for humanism. The idea that personal recognition and fulfillment, which had been turned aside by religious leaders all throughout medieval Europe, is going to, he says it's not dichotomous. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. You can have religious fulfillment and you can have personal recognition or personal fulfillment. And he goes as far as to say that religion, the way that you reach religious fulfillment is through your own personal experiences, religiously speaking. And so he does a variety of things. He's most famous for, he climbs this particular mountain and ends up at the top. And his reasoning is it's not for any other reason than to see what it looks like from the top of the mountain. And that is kind of an allegory for what his whole theory is about, the idea that we need to see for ourselves and explore for ourselves in order to reach personal fulfillment, in order to reach, in many ways, a connection to religion. And those concepts are going to pop up again when we begin to talk about guys like Jan Hus, who's the same time frame, and then eventually as we get to Martin Luther in 1517 and beyond. He really kind of rebels against the medieval religious teachings of the day. As I mentioned before, your religion was your life, and one of the things that is discussed by religious leaders is the poorer you are on earth, the richer you will be in heaven. And so there's this real push to not worry about money, to not worry about personal recognition, but to completely devote yourself to religion as opposed to your own personal experiences, your own personal worth. And that's really what Petrarch is rebelling against, this concept that you need to be poor, you need to be completely obedient in terms of religion in order to find success and fulfillment in that religion. He says, no, those aren't things that necessarily need to go hand in hand. You can be personally successful and you can reach religious fulfillment. You can reach heaven in that same regard. And so we get to humanism. Here's kind of just some different pieces of the humanist concept. The school of thought, the idea is that you're going away from religious learning and towards learning of reason and yourself. How do you use that information to then develop your own worldview, including religious worldview? Anytime you see ism, think school of thought. Okay, anytime you see ism, it's a school of thought. Humanists are really going to harken back to the classics, and this is what is going to set the basis for the Renaissance. We'll see it in artwork, we'll see it in literature as well. It's a reawakening of the classics from Greece and Rome, going back to philosophers like Socrates, like Aristotle, like Plato, going back to thinkers and writers such as Virgil, such as Ovid, poetry. It's much in the same realm. The idea of empiricism, the way that we learn is through personal experience. This is going to go all the way back to Aristotle's very rudimentary concept of the scientific theory. That'll come much, much later, but the idea of testing things and trying things out, Aristotle's really going to take a pseudo-scientific approach to it. That's empiricism, the idea that you test things, that you experience them, as opposed to just thinking about a particular theory from a very philosophical point of view, through a very philosophical lens. This is eventually, as I mentioned, going to be leading us into the tenets of the Renaissance. What are the things that the Renaissance is going to be based on? It's a rebirth of cultural learning, a rebirth of classical thinking from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And that's all going to come up as we move through. I do want to touch a little bit more. I didn't get a chance to mention it from Petrarch yet, but Petrarch is very, very well schooled in he's very, very well schooled in Latin, and so he can write classically. And that's what all scientific writing is done in Latin. And so that means it's inaccessible to the majority of the population who are not classically trained. There's no formal education system, and so as a result, only the richest of the rich have their kids learn these classics and learn the classical languages. So that's really what the scientific writings are based in. But for Petrarch also writes a variety, over 362, I think, letters to a woman named Laura. And there's a lot of speculation. Is she just a metaphor for, someone that you would love, or is there actual Laura? And it's possible that this Laura is an actual governess that he pined over. But he writes all these letters. He never actually sends them to her or shows them to her. And he's just kind of lost in his own thoughts of love and what this Laura means to him. But one of the main reasons why it means so much, as I mentioned with Boccaccio, he's writing in the vernacular. He's writing in the common language of the day. He's writing in Italian. And this is a real stretch from most of the writing that's done. As I mentioned, reading texts is really something that is contained within the upper classes of society. But by writing in the vernacular, now you're giving access to people who have never previously had access to information, to stories, etc. And that's going to be a common theme as we move forward in European history. If you have any questions, please make sure you let me know. Other than that, we are finished, and I hope you all have a great day.